survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre. 2 weeks ago, I celebrated my 107th birthday. Today, I'm visiting Washington, D.C. for the first time in my life. I'm here seeking justice, and I'm asking my country to acknowledge what happened in Tulsa in 1921. The night of the massacre, I was awakened by my family. My parents and 5 siblings were there. I was told we had to leave, and that was it. I will never forget the violence of the white mob when we left our home. I still see black men being shot, black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams. I have lived through the massacre every day. Our country may forget this history, but I cannot. I will not, and other survivors do not, and our descendants do not. When my family was forced to leave Tulsa, I lost my chance of an education. I never finished school past the 4th grade. I have never made much money in my country. State and city took a lot from me. Despite this, I spent time supporting the war effort in the shipyards of California, but most of my life I was a domestic worker serving white families. I never made much money, but to this day I can barely afford my everyday needs. I'm asking that my country acknowledge what has been happened to me, the traumas and the pain, the loss, and I ask survivors and descendants to be given a chance to seek justice, open the door. For 70 years, the city of Tulsa and its stream of charmers told us that the massacre didn't happen, like we didn't see it with our own eyes. You have me here right now. You see Mother Randall, you see my brother, Hughes Van Ellis. We live this history, and we can't ignore it. We lost everything that day, our homes, our churches, our newspapers, our theaters, our lives. Greenwood represented all the best of what was possible for black people in America and for all the people. No one cared about us for almost 100 years. We and our history have been forgotten, washed away. This Congress must recognize us and our history. For Black America, for the white Americans, and for all Americans.
100 years ago, at this hour, on this first day of June, smoke darkened the Tulsa sky. This was not a riot. This was a massacre. I come here to help fill the silence, because in silence, wounds deepen. What happened in Greenwood was an act of hate and domestic terrorism, with a through line that exists today still.
Learn to do what is right. Promote justice. Give the oppressed reason to celebrate. Take up the cause of the orphan. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Ensure justice for those being crushed. Yes, speak up for the poor and helpless, and see that they get justice. Proverbs 31, verses 8 and 9, New Living Translation. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. Matthew 23, verses 23 and 24, NIV. Hi, everybody, and welcome to The Breathing Room, a space where people of color and faith can come together to have our lived experiences acknowledged, to witness each other's journey, and to take a collective deep breath. My name is Kevin Holland. This is episode 5, and the title is The Tulsa Race Massacre, What It Teaches Us About Our Racial Reckoning Today. This past Monday was Memorial Day, and it was also the centennial of one of the most heinous, barbaric events of white supremacist domestic terrorism ever to happen in the United States. Coincidentally, a dear friend of mine who was a pastor who was white and in his early 50s and who was born and raised in Oklahoma happened to be visiting his family back in Oklahoma this past weekend and was there for the centennial remembrance of the Tulsa Race Massacre. He told me that even though he's in his early 50s, he just learned about the incident last year in 2020, and that it hadn't even been added to the Oklahoma history books until 2019. What a massive cover-up. What a massive expose and denial. What an uncovering of a part of the psyche and DNA of America. In the next few minutes, I'd like to read a couple of articles that I found enlightening, heartbreaking, and empowering regarding this incredibly horrific event, the Tulsa Race Massacre. After the articles, I want to share a few thoughts and a takeaway. It's obvious that there are lessons Spirit wants us to take as we move forward in dealing with our own racial reckoning, and that's what I hope this episode helps us accomplish. A century ago, a prosperous black neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma perished at the hands of a violent white mob. The Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 killed hundreds of residents, burned more than 1,250 homes, and erased years of black success. The title of this New York Times article is What the Tulsa Race Massacre Destroyed. It's by Yulia Pershina Kotis, Anjali Singhvi, Audra D.S. Birch, Troy Griggs, Mika Grandal, Lindong Wong, Tim Wallace, Jeremy White, and Josh Williams, and was published on May 24th, 2021. Imagine a country of great possibilities and prosperity built by black people for black people. Places to work, places to live, places to learn and shop and play, places to worship. Now imagine it being ravaged by flames. In May 1921, the Tulsa, Oklahoma neighborhood of Greenwood was a fully realized antidote to the racial oppression of the time. Built in the early part of the century in a northern pocket of the city, it was a thriving community of commerce and family life to its roughly 10,000 residents. Brick and wood frame homes dotted the landscape along with blocks lined with grocery stores, hotels, nightclubs, billiard halls, theaters, doctors' offices, and churches. Greenwood was so promising, so vibrant that it became home to what was known as America's Black Wall Street. But what took years to build was erased in less than 24 hours by racial violence, sending the dead into mass graves and forever altering family trees. Hundreds of Greenwood residents were brutally killed, their homes and businesses wiped out. They were casualties of a furious and heavily armed white mob of looters and arsonists. One factor that drove the violence: resentment toward the black prosperity found in block after block of Greenwood. The financial toll of the massacre is evident in the $1.8 million in property loss claims, $27 million in today's dollars, detailed in a 2001 State Commission report. For 2 decades, the report has been one of the most comprehensive accounts to reveal the horrific details of the massacre, among the worst racial terror attacks in the nation's history, as well as the government's culpability. The destruction of property is only one piece of the financial devastation that the massacre wrought. Much bigger is a sobering kind of inheritance, the incalculable and enduring loss of what could have been, and the generational wealth that might have shaped and secured the fortunes of black children and grandchildren. What if we had been allowed to maintain our family business? Asked Brenda Nails Alford, who was in her early 60s. The Greenwood Avenue shoe shop of her grandfather and his brother was destroyed. If they had been allowed to carry on that legacy, she said, there's no telling where we could be now. For decades, what happened in Greenwood was willfully buried in history. The Times analyzed census data, city directories, newspaper articles, and survivor tapes and testimonies from that time to show the types of people who made up the neighborhood and contributed to its vibrancy. The Marquee Block. Perhaps no other collection of businesses tells the story of Greenwood and black entrepreneurship better than the 100 block of Greenwood Avenue, rising near the southern tip of the neighborhood. This marquee block was the pulse of the black business community. More than 70 businesses operated in mostly 1, 2, and 3-story red brick buildings clustered along the block. All but a couple were owned by black entrepreneurs. In this stretch alone, there were 4 hotels, 2 newspapers, 8 doctors, 7 barbers, 9 restaurants, and a half dozen professional offices of real estate agents, dentists, and lawyers. A cabaret and a cigar shop were on the block too. You could shop for groceries, play pool, take in a theater show, eat dinner, or get your hair styled without ever leaving the block. My grandfather often talked about how you could enjoy a full life in Greenwood, that everything you needed or wanted was in Greenwood. You never had to go anywhere, said Star Williams, 40, the granddaughter of Otis Granville Clark, who was 18 during the massacre. He talked about seeing black success and how his sense of identity and pride came from Greenwood. The businesses on Greenwood Avenue were owned by people who were among Tulsa's most prominent black citizens. Lula and John Williams came to embody the entrepreneurial spirit of Greenwood. They owned a confectionery at 102 Greenwood Avenue and the East End garage around the corner on Archer Street. The couple owned the 750-seat Williams Dreamland Theater at 129 Greenwood Avenue, the first movie house for black people in the city. It offered both silent films and live shows and was also a community gathering spot. Dr. R.T. Bridgewater was a physician with a practice in the Woods Building at 101 to 105 Greenwood Avenue. He owned 17 rental houses and was also a community leader. Tulsa Star, a black-owned newspaper, called his home on the affluent North Detroit Street palatial. Several women set up shop as entrepreneurs in the same building. Mary E. Joseph Parrish was a teacher and journalist who operated a typing school. Mabel B. Little ran the Little Rose Beauty Salon. Susie Bell ran an upscale restaurant called Bell and Little Cafe with her brother Presley Little, Ms. Little's husband. It offered 6-course meals that were written about in the Tulsa Star. Buck Colbert Franklin, a lawyer, had an office inside a building owned by O.W. Gurley, one of Greenwood's founders. After the massacre, Mr. Franklin provided legal services from a tent. James Nails and his brother Henry ran a shoe shop in the Gist building at 121 Greenwood Avenue. The shop carried Black Swan Records, and the family also owned a dance pavilion and a skating rink in the community. A.J. Smitherman, a journalist and civil rights activist, founded the Tulsa Star, which was headquartered at 126 Greenwood Avenue. The paper reported on stories of racial violence and advocated for the rights of African Americans. J.B. Stratford opened the posh 54-room Stratford Hotel at 301 Greenwood Avenue in 1918. It was considered among the nation's best hotels for African Americans at the time. A city within a city. Mr. Stratford and Mr. Gurley, who purchased large tracts of land in the early 1900s, were among the founders of Greenwood. They began building on the northern side of Tulsa beyond the railroad tracks, forming the bones of the city's predominantly black neighborhood that was separate from the white side of town. Greenwood was one of the few places in the country offering black citizens less than 6 decades out of enslavement a 3-dimensional life. By 1921, Greenwood had grown into a 35-block neighborhood with a bustling retail scene, as well as 2 schools, 2 newspapers, and a hospital. Here are some of the community's key places. Booker T. Washington School, which opened in 1913 with 14 students, had moved into its 3-story brick building in 1920. It would serve as a hospital and relief center after the massacre. Mount Zion Baptist Church was among some half-dozen churches that burned. It was the city's largest black church. There was also a small juke joint called Zulu Lounge, owned by Isaac Evett, who worked by day on a farm but after dark flung open the doors of Zulu. In the evenings, residents had their choice of entertainment. Survivor accounts that were relayed to relatives recalled neighbors getting gussied up to gather in Greenwood, with Thursdays being big because of Maid's Night Out. Black domestics, many of them live-in workers who cleaned the homes of white residents across town, were off that day. Many African Americans migrated to Tulsa after the Civil War, carrying dreams of new chapters of the kind of freedom found in owning businesses. Others made a living working as maids, waiters, chauffeurs, shoe shiners, and cooks in Tulsa's new oil class. In Greenwood, residents held more than 200 different types of jobs. About 40% of the community's residents were professionals or skilled craftspeople, like doctors, pharmacists, carpenters, and hairdressers, according to a Times analysis of the 1920 census. While a vast majority of the neighborhood rented, many residents owned their homes. Segregation kept African Americans from patronizing white-owned shops, and Greenwood thrived from community support of black-owned businesses. Black folks faced an economic detour, said Hannibal B. Johnson, an author and the education chair for the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission. When they approached the gates to the wider Tulsa economy, they were turned away, so they ended up creating their own largely insular community. The massacre that ended it all. The assaults on Greenwood raged over 2 days. The morning of June 2, 1921, revealed emptiness and ruin in every direction. Plumes of smoke hovered over the neighborhood. Ash coated the ground. Brick buildings had been reduced to bombed-out husks, and soon the bodies of those killed would be stacked and discarded in mass graves and a river. It all began on May 30th with 2 teenagers in an elevator in the Drexel building in downtown Tulsa and morphed into a sexual assault accusation. Accounts vary about what happened between Dick Rowland, 19, a young black shoe shiner, and Sarah Page, 17, a white elevator operator. One common theory suggests Mr. Rowland tripped and grabbed onto the arm of Miss Page while trying to catch his fall. She screamed and ran away, according to the commission report. The next day, Mr. Rowland was arrested and jailed in the Tulsa County Courthouse. By that afternoon, the Tulsa Tribune published a front-page news story with the headline, "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl in Elevator," which essentially mobilized a lynch mob that showed up at the courthouse. Twice, a group of armed black Tulsans, many of them World War I veterans, offered to help protect Mr. Rowland, but were turned away by the sheriff. As the black men were leaving the second time, a white man attempted to disarm a black veteran and a gun went off in the scuffle. That clash and others that day marked the beginning of what would become Greenwood's armed destruction. Some white rioters were even deputized and given weapons by civil officials. Near dawn, the white mob descended on Greenwood. Black Tulsans fought back valiantly, defending their families and property, but they were woefully outnumbered. The mob indiscriminately shot black people in the streets. Members of the mob ransacked homes and stole money and jewelry. They set fires house by house, block by block, according to the commission report. Terror came from the sky, too. White pilots flew airplanes that dropped dynamite over the neighborhood, the report stated, making the Tulsa aerial attack what historians call among the first of an American city. The numbers presented a staggering portrait of loss. 35 blocks burned to the ground, as many as 300 dead, hundreds injured, 8,000 to 10,000 left homeless, more than 1,470 homes burned or looted, and eventually 6,000 detained in internment camps. The neighborhood economy was destroyed. 24 grocery stores, 31 restaurants, 4 drugstores. Greenwood, where black success embodied the American dream, was no more, suddenly, dreadfully wiped out. What was lost? Greenwood would be rebuilt, and for a few decades it would again thrive before falling to urban renewal and other forces. But that spring of 1921 unmoored and unrooted the neighborhood with lasting effects. Not long after the attack, shell-shocked survivors who were blamed for the violence returned home to ruin. Amid the charred remnants, they were forced to make an excruciating decision that would change family histories forever: leave and start over somewhere else, or rebuild. They also faced another kind of white resistance, a fire ordinance intended to prevent black property owners from rebuilding on their own, and insurance companies that refused to pay damage claims. Greenwood wasn't a gift from anyone. It was created by the citizens of Greenwood who withstood the tragedy of 1921 and rebuilt it again, said Scott Ellsworth, the author of the recently released book, The Groundbreaking: An American City and Its Search for Justice. Greenwood is the story of resilience. It is the story of courage. Those who stayed began stitching their lives back together almost immediately. They joined forces and began rebuilding homes and businesses. Within a day, C.L. Netherland, a massacre survivor and minister whose barber shop at 110 Greenwood Avenue was destroyed, purchased a folding chair, a strap, and razor and set up shop on a sidewalk. The massacre also claimed the Mount Zion Baptist Church, whose first service in its new building had been held less than 2 months earlier. The congregation's hundreds of members had financed and built the $92,000 church over several years, according to Black Wall Street: From Riot to Renaissance in Tulsa's Historic Greenwood District, a book by Mr. Johnson, education chair for the Centennial Commission. It would have been easier to declare bankruptcy. Instead, church members rebuilt and dug in. It took an additional 21 years before the initial debt was repaid. The final insult of the massacre came in the silence. For decades, Tulsa deliberately ignored and covered up what had happened in Greenwood. Many descendants said they learned about the mob and the killings only as adults, and even then, some of the recounting was told in whispers. You could see the pain in my grandmother's eyes when she talked about what happened, said Leroy Gibbs II, 52, the grandson of Ernestine Gibbs, a massacre survivor who was 17 when the violence unfolded. Before she would get too far, before it became too painful, she would shift and start talking about where we are today. Some surviving business owners who built the 100 block of Greenwood Avenue had remarkable second chapters. Others who struggled in the aftermath had heartbreaking stories. The Williams family, among the most successful before the massacre, stayed and rebuilt. Mr. Smitherman, the civil rights activist who ran the Tulsa Star, eventually landed in Buffalo, where he became the publisher of the Buffalo Star, later named the Empire Star. He was among several black Tulsans indicted for inciting a riot and was exonerated posthumously. Miss Parrish, the journalist who ran a typing school, stayed to chronicle the massacre. The two wealthy men who helped found Greenwood were hit hard financially. Mr. Stratford, who was indicted, escaped to Kansas and then Chicago. He never recovered his fortune. Mr. Gurley reportedly lost nearly $158,000 in 1921, or $2.3 million in today's dollars. James Nails, who had opened a shoe shop with his brother Henry, rebuilt but never really recovered. He eventually left Tulsa. He was really unable to carry on emotionally, psychologically, Miss Nails Alfred said. You get your education, you work hard, you start businesses, you're able to employ your family members and community members, and then you lose it all within hours. It takes away a man's dignity. There is a pending lawsuit and ongoing discussions about how and whether to compensate the families of the Tulsa massacre victims. No compensation has ever been paid under court order or by legislation. To this day, not one person has been prosecuted or punished for the devastation and ruin of the original Greenwood. As an addendum, I wanted to read this short excerpt of an article from Smithsonian Magazine. It's called Breaking Ground. A long-lost manuscript contains a searing eyewitness account of the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. An Oklahoma lawyer details the attacks by hundreds of whites on the thriving black neighborhood where hundreds died 95 years ago. In the conclusion of the article, the author writes, riot postcards were often distributed, crassly and cruelly, as a way to sell white supremacy. At the time, they were shown as documents that were shared between white community members to demonstrate their power. Later, they became part of the body of evidence that was used during the Commission for Reparation. In 2001, the Tulsa Race Riot Commission issued a report detailing the damage from the riots, but legislative and legal attempts to gain reparations for the survivors have failed. The Tulsa race riots aren't mentioned in most American history textbooks, and many people don't know that they happened. Curator Paul Gardullo says the crucial question is why not? Throughout American history, there's been a vast silence about the atrocities that were performed in the service of white history. There are a lot of silences in relation to this story and a lot of guilt and shame, Gardullo explains. How do you tell a story about destruction? How do you balance the fortitude and resilience of people in response to that devastation? How do you fill the silences? How do you address the silences about a story that this community has held in silence for so long and in denial for so long? John W. Franklin says his grandfather's manuscript is important for people to see because it deals with suppressed history. This is an eyewitness account from a reputable source about what he saw happen. His grandson, John W. Franklin, says, it is definitely relevant today because I think our notions of justice are based partially on our own history and our knowledge of history. But we are an ahistorical society in that we don't know our past. When I take a minute to try to absorb what I just read, I just don't think I can do it fully. The level of inhumanity, cruelty, sadism, pulsing hatred, godlessness, demonic, satanic, possessed evil is hard for me to process. Something that I do clearly see is that white supremacy is embedded in the fabric of the American mind, and that racial violence upon black people, beginning with slavery and up to today, is seen as the birthright birthright of the general white population. And even those in our country that are of the dominant culture and that are white who would never harm a black person have learned to live with as normal and not be bothered by others of their ilk killing or harming other black bodies. That's what I'm really disturbed about. It's how normalized this has all become to both people of color and those of the dominant culture. I also see this evil pattern, and I think it's worthwhile for us to pay attention to it, because once you learn the pattern, then you can detect it more easily and quickly when you see it being repeated in present and future events. First, there is a lie or a perceived threat that is used as a trumped up charge. Doesn't matter whether it's true. It's just something, that level of white supremacy and prejudice and bigotry feels like, because they have had power for so long, that anything they conjure up is correct and they are fact immune. And so you see a big lie, a trumped up charge that is fact immune being perpetrated and said often enough and repeated to where people believe it. In their minds, then that enables them and legitimizes their turning to violence. And so they visit physical violence with impunity on people of color, feeling justified in the imagined slight. They gaslight because they have been the most advantaged people in history in the United States of America, and yet have convinced themselves that they are the victims and they deserve to be aggrieved. Then they gaslight again and then accuse the black people of visiting the violence and stoking it and them being innocent victims. And then they deny that it ever happened and obfuscate and both sides and utter false equivalencies. And then quote unquote good people of the dominant culture, the good white people, just stay silent. My question is, in June of 1921, where were all the white, love your neighbor as you love yourself, do unto others as you would have them do unto you? Where were all of those good Bible-believing Christians during this time? And are we any different today in our churches than they were then? I sure love people of color. I love all people. I'm colorblind, but there's nothing you can do to get me to speak out against one of my own, no matter what they do. We've seen that this year, in the end of 2020, the beginning of 2021. On Memorial Day this past Monday, I posted about the Tulsa Race Massacre on my IG account, and I asked people to comment or respond with when they learned about the Tulsa Race Massacre that happened in 1921. And it was great interaction. Most people said they just learned of it in 2020. However, there was one person who purports to be a Christian, and this is what he wrote. #Memorial Day. What would Jesus do? As a pastor, cause dissension? Why would a pastor post this on Memorial Day? Memorial Day is for who died for United States of America, not other issues. #All lives matter. #Jesus is the way. #promote facts of Memorial Day. #be united. Now, this was an outlier given all the other people that had posted, but I'm so glad he did, because this shows the attitude that we are up against as we try to work for racial unity, for racial justice, to advocate for racial reconciliation and true justice. In this person's comments, there was no acknowledgement of the evil of the event, no acknowledgement of how everybody else was feeling. It completely ignored anything else, and that's what those who refuse to see do. They claim if you bring up injustice, even though the scriptures are full of commands for us to promote justice and to ensure that justice happens. Some people say if you bring up the issue that you're being divisive or you're causing dissension. They ignore or deflect or minimize the cause for which Black Lives Matter was created and stands with All Lives Matter. In response to you speaking the truth in love about the sins of a nation and of individuals, they respond with be united. So that's what it is, 2021. Part of me feels like this is just hopeless. The paths are so embedded. They're so worn. There have been so many centuries of just compounded evil. But something else in me feels like saying it out loud, saying it in public, saying it in a space where there are people that won't deny it will have some effect, will have some impact, hopefully even more for the next generation, which is why I think we need to keep at it. By the way, I feel a sense of incredible pride and awe of my ancestors, of your ancestors, of all those who've gone before us and all they've achieved against such incredible odds. Talk about having the deck stacked against you in a society built and programmed to harm you and to make you less than and to exploit you and to advantage people who don't look like you. It makes the achievements even more breathtaking. It makes me want to do my part to advance the cause, even if we just move the needle 1 degree. That 1 degree to me is worth it. Thanks again for spending some time in the Breathing Room, a space where people of color and faith can come together to have our lived experiences acknowledged, to witness each other's journey, and to take a collective deep breath. Be sure to subscribe to the Breathing Room on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, or however you listen. And if you like this episode, don't forget to leave a rating and a review. To connect with us, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, or send us an email at thebreathingroompod@gmail.com. For The Breathing Room, I'm Kevin Holland, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.